Bella.
Welcome back to our channel, Elementary My Dear,
where we make nutrition science easy for you to digest.
Today we're talking about if big food is out to get us.
Make sure you hit the subscribe button so you never miss one of our videos. There is big beef in the nutrition science community. Coming out this month in the Journal of American Journal of Clinical Nutrition? The Journal of American Clinical Nutrition?
American Journal of Clinical Nutrition.
Yes, there we go.
Okay. We're ready. We're so prepared, guys.
In the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, two big names in the field of nutrition science are going head to head to talk about the contentious issue of processed foods. Basically, the question that they were answering is there utility in having food recommendations, like that's things that are put out by the government, so like for example the Canada's Food Guide, is there a value in having recommendations about food processing, specifically recommendations on what are considered ultra processed foods?
Processed foods is definitely a term that gets thrown around a lot by wellness influencers. I think there's a lot of fear around processed foods, and it often gets referred to as like fake food or like not really food. So when you hear the term ultra processed foods, I think you might think of things like chips and candy and all this stuff. But there's actually a very specific definition behind it. There's a classification system called NOVA that has 4 groups or categories. Group 1 is called unprocessed or minimally processed foods, and it includes things like fruits and vegetables and grains and nuts and seeds, fish, meat, etc. So basically more or less foods that are in their whole forms. In some cases there might be minimal processing where inedible components are removed but nothing is added back in. Then we have group 2, which is processed culinary ingredients. So that's things like cooking oils, spices, sugar or maple syrup, etc. Group 3 is processed foods, which are things like canned vegetables, canned meats, canned fish, cheese, some breads, wine, beer, etc.
Then finally we have group 4, which are ultra processed foods, and these are foods that have gone through extreme amounts of processing where they no longer have semblance of any of those group 1 foods, and they have a lot of additives that are things that you would not find in your regular kitchen. So that's where you get like the lecithins and the E numbers and all those different things added into those foods. Typically includes a lot of the things that you think of when you think of processed foods, like chips and candy, burgers, ice cream, but also a lot of foods that you might not necessarily think would be in that category are also in that category. So certain breads, like I just think off the top of my head, like the Wonder Breads of the world, where you read the ingredients list and you're like, what is half of this stuff? That would be an ultra processed food. Certain yogurts. It is a lot more wide ranging than a lot of people think it is.
The thing about ultra processed foods is that they tend to be very convenient to eat. They're often packaged in a way that extends their shelf life. They require little to no preparation. You can kind of eat them on the go. You can find them anywhere, grocery stores, convenience stores, vending machines, anywhere really. A common theme with, I think, most ultra processed foods is they tend to be very hyper palatable, making it very easy to eat them and enjoy them.
That's where a lot of the debate within the science world is, are these foods inherently bad?
Believe it or not all researchers actually think that ultra-processed foods are to be blamed for our health crisis.
Around the world, there have been several countries and governments, as well as health recommendation bodies, that have put out a lot of warning signs about these ultra-processed foods. For example, one of the biggest countries that's taken the largest stand when it comes to ultra-processed foods is Brazil. In their food guide, it explicitly says to choose minimally processed foods the most often, and then prepare those minimally processed foods with a little bit of the processed culinary ingredients, and then you can enjoy processed foods on occasion, and tells people to completely avoid ultra processed foods. Is there actually any benefit to these guidelines above and beyond, our conventional wisdom about healthy eating?
We have one really prominent researcher by the name of Dr. Monteiro. He's a professor at the University of Sao Paulo, and he does believe that there should be guidelines and recommendations around ultra-processed foods, and namely to discourage the consumption of ultra-processed foods. There are 3 main reasons for his perspective. One is that he believes that ultra-processed foods are associated with poor diet quality. Second, that ultra-processed foods are linked to poor health outcomes. And third, that there are plausible mechanisms connecting the consumption of ultra-processed foods and poor health outcomes.
And then on the other hand, we have Dr. Astrup. He is from some random Scandinavian university, which is called
University of Copenhagen. Is it that random? It's probably the biggest university in that country.
Probably. He believes that having guidance around ultra-processed foods does not protect the public's health above and beyond our current guidance. From some of his arguments, it actually seems like he believes it may actually be harmful. Dr. Astrup's key points are that the evidence in this field is not very strong. While we have many observational trials, we don't have many RCTs. He also says that the impacts of ultra-processed foods do not go above and beyond what we already know in terms of nutrients that cause disease. Having a high energy content food, fat content, sugar content, salt content, etc. He also argues that this classification system is really vague, and so implementing this would be hard for people to use, and actually, if there is not a precise definition, could be harmful and lead to elimination of this food group for no reason based off of a vague definition. We have these two big names, and they're both saying these very different things. And I think that's where people get confused and they're just like, oh, you guys don't know anything.
In this case, both researchers are very much looking at the exact same body of literature. Sometimes they're citing the exact same research studies and reaching very different conclusions. That's, I think, very common in this space. Nutrition science is very difficult. I think research in general can be very challenging, but I think nutrition science is kind of different from other types of science, like, things like chemistry and physics. In a laboratory setting, you can very much control a lot of variables that you want to control, and you can see what the outcome is, and you can very precisely measure those outcomes, and it's right in front of you. You have the tools to do it in a very precise way. Nutrition science is way more complicated because you're talking about human beings living out in the real world, and especially if you're talking about long-term health outcomes, and that is what we're talking about in a lot of cases. How do you control for people? You can't control people's lives, what they're eating, their physical activity, what they're smoking, what they're drinking, what kind of life they live on a day-to-day basis for decades. It's just not something that's realistic in a lot of research questions within this space. I suspect that as we go through this video, that where we stand and where our bias lies, I think it's going to be very clear, but let's get into it. Let's go back to the first dude, Dr. Monteiro. Probably not saying that right, but just going with the flow here. One of his main arguments is that the consumption of ultra-processed foods is associated with poor diet quality. And there is a lot of evidence to support this. A lot of ultra-processed foods tend to be higher in saturated fat, higher in sugar, higher in sodium, higher in energy. And at the same time, they do also tend to be lower in fiber and protein and other micronutrients that we know are protective for good health outcomes.
But Dr. Astrup says that we already know that. We know that salt, sugar, and fat are bad for you and fiber is good for you. But those qualities are not inherent to ultra-processed food. And having this demonization of ultra-processed food leads to people giving a health halo to certain things and avoiding certain things that could actually be healthy just because they are processed, and then vice versa, saying that this thing is healthy because it is not processed.
The distinction that Astrup is trying to make is that it's not the processing that's the problem, it's the nutritional composition of the food, which is fair. It's a matter of semantics at that point, and I think there is some value in just making the distinction that it's not necessarily the processing that's inherently leading to a poor nutritional composition. It's just, I think, what ends up happening most of the time in practice, in real life, because the food industry is incentivized to create products that have certain textural qualities, have certain taste qualities, and be as cheap as possible because they want to grow their consumer base and continue to make money and have people coming back. And the way to do that is making the most delicious food possible for as cheap as possible on their end.
And that often comes with the salt, sugar, fat, etc.
But I think, the distinction that Astrup is making is that it doesn't have to be that way. Maybe a couple of months ago, we made a video on greens powders. I don't even know if that counts as a food or a supplement, but I would qualify that as an ultra-processed food item.
Definitely.
That at the end of the day is actually low in saturated fat, low in sugar, low in sodium, and very high in a lot of micronutrients. So I can see what he's getting at, but I think in practice what we see is that ultra-processed foods do tend to have a certain nutritional profile.
And something that Monteiro touches upon is that we can't actually say that the processing in and of itself is not harmful, because when we talk about things like modifications to texture that we would never get doing in your kitchen, that can lead to overconsumption. Some of those processing elements that are added in, you know, every so often we have to like take certain ones of those chemicals off the list because like, oh, sorry, that does something bad, so our bad, we'll like replace it with something else. We can't say that those processing agents aren't harmful. Dr. Astrup kind of counters that by saying like a lot of the things that are added as food additives come from foods already. So like things like lecithin, that's found in eggs already, or ascorbic acid or citric acid, that's found in fruits already. So while they're adding these in, these are not things that you wouldn't get in your diet already. That's like an area where they are using the exact same data, but their philosophies around it very much influence what they're saying.
Have you ever like taken like a communication course where they always show that cartoon of like there's like a number 6, or like it looks like I'm sitting this way, you're sitting there, it looks like a 6 to me, it looks like a 9 to you, and we're both like I'm right. I think that's a very good visual representation of what's happening.
Yeah.
The second main point that Dr. Monteiro makes is that, well, consumption of ultra-processed foods seems to be associated with poor health outcomes. We have seen consistently in the literature, particularly cohort studies and other observational studies, that those that consume diets high in ultra-processed foods tend to have greater risk for cardiovascular disease, diabetes, obesity, hypertension, certain cancers.
But Dr. Astrup, he came in and he was like, listen, I'm not going to take any of that into account. Maybe my bias is showing this. He's like, screw all those studies. I'm not taking any of that into account because they're all observational trials.
Generally speaking, the general rule of thumb is that randomized controlled trials or experiments are the best and ideal way to figure out a causal relationship between two variables. So in this case, the two variables being consumption of ultra-processed foods and health outcomes. And each one, there could be a million questions, specific research questions within that, but that's generally the rule of thumb, that we need experiments, because experiments allow you to isolate every other variable so that you can just tweak one thing and then see what happens to that outcome that you're interested in. However, as we kind of keep bringing up, it's very hard to actually do that when you're talking about nutrition and diet quality and long-term health outcomes. It's just not feasible. You can do short-term experiments, as much, sometimes as long as a year maybe, but it's really hard to go any further than that. And even then, it's kind of hard to really know what people are doing. Adherence is really hard to measure and account for. That's a whole other thing. Knowing that, in nutrition science and other fields like epidemiology, we do have other ways of being fairly certain that there's a causal relationship between two variables. So there's things like, is it consistent across the literature, the correlation that you're seeing? If we find that research from around the world, repeated multiple times, different research teams, if they're all kind of arriving at the same conclusion, even if it is observational, that supports the perspective that perhaps there's a causal relationship there. There's also, well, how strong is that correlation? Because, there's statistical stuff, you can figure out, you can put a number to this, like how strong the correlation is between two variables. And if that seems to be consistently high across the board as well, that's also very compelling evidence that there might be a causal relationship there. There's also temporality, so the outcome that you're interested in needs to come after the exposure. So, the poor health outcome, whether it's like diabetes or cardiovascular disease or whatever it is, has to kind of come after a certain amount of exposure to consuming ultra-processed foods. So you wouldn't necessarily include people that already have diabetes or whatever beforehand. Mm-hmm. And then there's also the specificity of the association. There's a whole list, like kind of like a checklist of items, if you want to call it that. It's called the Bradford Hill criteria for causality.
And when we look at the literature when it comes to ultra-processed foods, most of those checkboxes are checked off. But Dr. Astrup, he needs a higher burden of evidence for some reason for this. But you know what? He does bring up a point that most of these studies, when you control for the macronutrient content, so that's like the fat, protein, carbohydrates, and the energy, you actually lose a lot of that relationship between disease. I think that's like the biggest point of contention with these two people is it's like, one guy's like, yeah, like that's bad. That means that they're bad because ultra-processed foods tend to be bad and hiding these things. And this guy's like, well, no, we just know these things are bad, so why are we blaming this group of foods?
I see Astrup's view.
Mm-hmm.
I agree that... Actually, I don't know. I kind of go back and forth because you could argue that it comes down to purely the nutrition composition. And I think there is a lot of evidence that kind of points in that direction. But the problem or the hole in that perspective, I think, is the fact that, you know, as we kind of alluded to in the beginning, most ultra-processed foods are very hyper-palatable and they're very specifically and intentionally designed to trigger a certain reward system in our brain. The way that the food is designed, it's such that, you know, by the time it gets to your stomach, you don't really feel full. Like, they're very intentionally designed to do these things. So in this context, these variables go beyond the nutrition composition. It goes to the chemical structure, like beyond just the nutrition.
It's the food matrix.
The food matrix as a whole.
He, in his own article, is like, well, how come if I get a burger from McDonald's, that's an ultra-processed food, but if I make a burger at home, that's healthy. You're saying that's healthy. And then Montero was like, that's not what I said. But
I feel like Astrup is intentionally trying to be dense. Him conflating the two, I feel like is intellectually dishonest. I feel like he's just being devil's advocate for the sake of it.
I think so a little bit. But I think that's actually harmful in this case. The randomized control trial that they both brought up, and one guy was like, yeah, this is great. And another guy was like, screw that study. They basically got a bunch of people to come like live in a hospital basically for 2 weeks. Part of it, they ate a diet that was 83% ultra-processed foods. People in the ultra-processed food group actually ended up eating 500 calories more, which over the 2-week period that they were eating this 83% ultra-processed food diet translated into 0.9 kilograms, and for the imperial folks out there, that's about 2 pounds. The people in the ultra-processed food diet ate more, and that's kind of consistent with my own personal biases and beliefs and like life experience, and I know no one cares about my experience.
I think it's a very relatable experience. I'm sure almost everyone watching can relate to having a bowl of chips or a bowl of candy in front of you and being in a movie theater and eating like a giant bag of popcorn and still being able to walk out and go for dinner afterwards. You know what I mean? Like, so why are we even talking about all this? We wanted to draw attention to the fact that nutrition science is very complex, and I think often in, you know, the public discourse, I think there's kind of a general mistrust of nutrition and institutions in general, but I think a lot of nutrition bodies and health bodies, there's this idea that
we're changing our minds all the time, we don't know what's going on, like no one knows anything, like whatever.
This is a very complex science, and even some of the most prominent researchers in this field, looking at the exact same body of research, may not always agree. But ultimately, the beauty of science is that as time progresses, we're going to get more and more research joining this foundation of research that we have. You know, we say this in probably 80% of our videos, but you can never just look at one study, even 2 studies, even 5, 10 studies. You have to look at the entire body of literature, and there can absolutely be inconsistent things in there. They could be even directly contradictory things in there. But ultimately, when you look at the body of research, it will kind of trend in one direction or another. That may not happen right away.
Even when we're looking at these two researchers, it sounds like they're arguing completely different points, but there are a lot of common threads. I think that's where the truth lies.
Both researchers actually agree on a lot of things, and one of the main things that they both agree on is that diets that are high in sugar, sodium, and saturated fat tend to reflect poor diet quality and tend to lead to poor health outcomes, and that we do know a lot of the physiological mechanisms which would result in that. I think the question more is that Montero kind of feels that ultra-processed foods inherently have those qualities, and therefore guidelines should be developed to discourage consumption of those foods. Whereas Astrup feels that those qualities, those nutritional qualities, are not a direct result of processing. There are other variables that are resulting in that. It's not the processing in and of itself to blame. But ultimately, they both agree that these dietary qualities, these specific nutrients, if they're making up a significant portion of your diet, probably is not a good idea. In practice, in our current food environment, with the kind of options that are on the market, if you were to try to minimize your intake of those foods, I think you would end up having to minimize your intake of ultra-processed foods. Now, if our food environment and our food market completely changed, and the types of ultra-processed foods that we had access to happen to be very nutrient rich and not hyper palatable to the point where you will tend to over consume them, then maybe this will no longer be a relevant conversation. But I think in our current state of affairs, the reality is that most ultra-processed foods on the market are rich in sugar, sodium, and saturated fat.
Well guys, thank you so much for watching. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the notification bell so you never miss one of our videos, and follow us on our Instagram and our TikTok.
Thank you for watching. Bye!
Bye!